Imagine opening a dating app that quietly removes everyone who shared your childhood breakfast table. No warning, no explanation, they are simply gone. Human beings may do something similar, except the filter can begin working years before puberty, long before anyone explains genetics, marriage law, or why family reunions should not become speed dating events. The obvious answer is that people avoid incest because society forbids it. But that answer arrives too late. Across cultures, rules differ enormously, yet the strongest prohibitions usually gather around the closest family relationships. Beneath those rules may be an older system. The brain notices who lived beside you during childhood, who your mother treated like another child, and who became permanently filed under family. Then it quietly lowers sexual interest. That sounds neat. It is not. Childhood familiarity is only a clue, not a DNA test. It can mistake an unrelated child for kin. It can miss a relative raised elsewhere. And genetics can explain why close inbreeding carries costs without telling us how prehistoric humans detected those costs or whether they consciously understood them. So, did humans invent the incest taboo? Or did culture build laws around an avoidance system evolution had already begun? To answer that, we need childhood memories, hidden mutations, ancient genomes, and one awkward biological filter. The short answer is that mating with very close biological relatives can increase the genetic risks carried by their children. Over many generations, any behavior that reduced those risks could leave more surviving descendants. That is the short answer. It is also dangerously easy to misunderstand. Close relatives are not biologically forbidden from having children, and a harmful outcome is never guaranteed. The problem is probability. Relatives are more likely to carry copies of the same inherited variants. If some of those variants are harmful and recessive, their children have a greater chance of receiving two matching copies, allowing an effect that was hidden in the parents to appear. Natural selection does not need anyone to understand this. No prehistoric elder had to draw a family tree in the dirt, circle two relatives, and announce that homozygosity was becoming unacceptable. Individuals who dispersed, avoided close childhood companions as partners, or formed relationships outside their immediate family may simply have produced more surviving descendants. But now the explanation creates a new problem. Genes do not glow. Related people do not arrive with warning labels. A hunter-gatherer could not inspect someone's chromosomes beside the fire. Even today, without records or testing, humans can be wrong about biological relationships. So the evolutionary cost explains why incest avoidance could be favored. It does not explain how the brain decided who counted as family. For that, evolution needed clues. Here is the biological problem. Most of your genes come in pairs. One copy came from your mother, the other from your father. Sometimes one copy contains a harmful recessive variant. Usually, the second working copy can hide its effects. You can carry the variant, live normally, and never know it is there. Evolution has filled humanity with these quiet genetic passengers. Very reassuring. Now, imagine two closely related people having a child. Because they inherited much of their DNA from the same recent ancestors, they are more likely to carry identical copies of the same rare variants. Their child, therefore, has a higher chance of receiving the harmful copy from both sides. With no working copy left to mask it, the hidden effect can appear. This increase in genetic similarity is called homozygosity. When it lowers survival, fertility, growth, or general biological fitness, the broader result is called inbreeding depression. But none of this works like a curse. A child of close relatives is not guaranteed to inherit a disorder, while children of unrelated parents can still inherit harmful variants. Relatedness changes the odds. The closer the biological relationship, the more genetic material the parents are likely to share, and the greater the opportunity for matching recessive variants to meet. Think of two people arriving with separate bags of genetic errors. Unrelated people may carry different errors. Close relatives are more likely to have copied theirs from the same family bag. That created a real evolutionary problem, but natural selection still needed some behavior capable of reducing it. And a probability hidden inside chromosomes is not something an animal can feel. The neat version of this story goes like this. Prehistoric humans noticed that children born to close relatives were sometimes less healthy, connected the pattern, and invented the incest taboo. It is a satisfying explanation. It gives our ancestors careful observation, a public meeting, and apparently several generations of excellent record keeping. But the pattern would have been extremely difficult to see. Many harmful recessive variants are rare. Some affect fertility rather than appearance. Others influence survival only when combined with disease, poor nutrition, or environmental stress. A child might appear healthy. Another might become ill for reasons completely unrelated to parental kinship. In a small mobile group, separating one genetic cause from infection, injury, hunger, and bad luck would be almost impossible. More importantly, evolution does not wait for understanding. If people who left their birth group, formed partnerships beyond their immediate family, or felt less attraction toward close childhood companions produced more surviving descendants, those tendencies could spread without anyone knowing why? No rule was required at the beginning. No one had to discover recessive inheritance. A behavior only had to alter reproductive outcomes, slightly but repeatedly, across many generations. Culture could then arrive later and make the pattern visible. It could give relatives names, define forbidden partners, attach disgust or punishment to violations, and turn an uncertain tendency into an explicit rule. So the taboo may not have created incest avoidance. It may have organized, strengthened, and expanded something older. And that changes the mystery. We are no longer looking for the first prehistoric lawgiver. We are looking for the clues the brain used before laws existed. Now here is the unlikely clue. A child watching their mother hold a newborn. That scene looks ordinary. No ritual. No family tree. No one explains chromosomes. The older child simply sees a familiar woman their mother feeding, carrying, protecting, and repeatedly returning to the baby. For the brain, that association may be unusually valuable. Researchers call it maternal perinatal association, observing your biological mother caring for another child during the period around that child's birth. In ancestral conditions, that was a strong clue that the baby was your sibling, not perfect. Human families have never been simple, but reliable enough for natural selection to use. The system seems to have another clue as well: how long two children live together while growing up. This matters because the clues are not equally available. An older child can watch their mother care for a newborn sibling. A younger child cannot travel backward in time to observe the birth of an older sibling. Their brain may instead rely more heavily on years of shared meals, sleeping spaces, arguments, illnesses, and the ancient tradition of one child touching another child's belongings without permission. In studies of siblings, these cues were associated with several different responses. They predicted willingness to help a sibling, aversion to sexual contact with that sibling, and moral opposition to sexual relationships between siblings. When maternal association was available, it appeared to outweigh simple duration of co-residence. When it was absent, years spent living together became more informative. This does not mean the brain contains a tiny official stamping forms marked related. Researchers use models like a kinship index to describe how several clues may be combined into an estimate. The estimate regulates behavior. It is not conscious arithmetic. And because it is an estimate, it can be wrong. Two unrelated children raised together may be treated psychologically like siblings. Two biological siblings raised apart may lack the normal childhood cues. Familiarity is therefore not proof of relatedness. It is a shortcut built for environments where growing up beside someone usually meant sharing family. This evidence comes from modern people, not directly from a prehistoric camp. It cannot tell us exactly when the mechanism evolved, but it reveals how incest avoidance could operate without genetic knowledge, written law, or conscious calculation. The brain did not need to see DNA. It only needed to remember who had always been there. This brings us to two of the most famous natural experiments in the history of incest avoidance. The first came from Israeli kibbutzim, where many children were raised together in communal peer groups. They ate, studied, worked, and slept near one another for years, despite usually being biologically unrelated. Researchers noticed that marriages between people raised in the same group were remarkably uncommon. At first, this looked like the Westermark effect caught in the wild. Raise children together early enough, and their brains classify one another as family. Except the evidence became less tidy when researchers returned to ask the adults what they had actually felt. Some former kibbutz members reported attraction toward childhood peers. Social expectations, group loyalty, limited privacy, and the fear of disrupting lifelong relationships may also have discouraged marriage. The absence of weddings did not automatically prove the presence of sexual aversion. Then there were Taiwan's minor marriages, known as simpua. In this arrangement, a young girl was adopted into another household and raised beside the boy she was expected to marry. The families had deliberately created future spouses. Childhood apparently had other plans. Compared with couples first brought together as adults, these marriages were associated with lower fertility, more divorce, and greater marital difficulty. The earlier the childhood association began, the stronger some of these patterns appeared. But this was not a laboratory experiment either. These marriages occurred inside systems shaped by parental authority, unequal power, economic pressure, and limited choice. Fertility was being used as an indirect clue about attraction, not as a direct measurement of it. Later analysis also suggested that age at first association predicted fertility more clearly for the younger partner than for the older one. That complication fits a multiple cue model. Younger children may rely heavily on years of co-residence. Older children may already have the stronger clue seeing their mother care for the newcomer. So the evidence does not give us a perfect switch labeled Westermarck effect. It gives us several imperfect clues pointing in the same direction. Avoidance probably did not begin as one perfect mechanism. It was more like several imperfect systems reducing the same risk from different directions. The first was movement. In many social animals, one sex often leaves the group where it was born. Humans are less predictable. Depending on ecology, kinship, marriage customs, and individual circumstances, men may move, women may move, both may move, or couples may shift between several communities. The important effect is not who leaves. It is that movement can reduce the number of close relatives available as partners, but dispersal only changes opportunity. It does not guarantee preference. That is where sexual aversion may matter. If someone shared your sleeping space, food, caregivers, illnesses, and arguments throughout childhood, the brain may classify them as family and lower sexual interest. Opportunity decreases from one side. Motivation decreases from the other. Then, human social networks add a third layer. Mobile foraging camps are not necessarily sealed collections of biological relatives. Families can move between camps, maintain ties across several settlements, and cooperate closely with unrelated people. Those networks provide more than new partners. They spread information, food, tools, obligations, and alliances. A relationship outside the immediate family can therefore connect two groups while also expanding the mating pool. None of these systems evolved solely to prevent incest. People move to find resources, escape conflict, join partners, or seek support. Non-kin friendships help cooperation and learning. Childhood attachment exists for reasons far broader than mate avoidance. But together, dispersal, aversion, and wider social networks can make close kin mating less likely without requiring a written rule. Evolution did not build a wall around the family dating pool. It added several exits. Ancient DNA gives us a completely different kind of evidence. When a child inherits the same stretch of DNA from both parents because those copies came from a recent common ancestor, the genome can contain long regions with very little variation. Geneticists call them runs of homozygosity, or ROH. The length matters. Shorter runs can accumulate when people belong to a small population whose members share distant ancestors. Very long runs are more likely when the parents themselves were close relatives. Recombination breaks inherited DNA into smaller pieces over generations, so unusually long matching stretches usually point toward a recent connection. In 2021, researchers screened the genomes of 1,785 ancient individuals who lived across the last 45,000 years. Only 54, about 3%, crossed a long ROH threshold consistent with first cousine or closer parentage, although extremely small mating populations can produce similar patterns. That makes the figure an upper bound rather than a direct count of cousin unions. Just one individual carried a pattern typical of parents related at the first degree, such as siblings or parent and child. That does not mean prehistoric humanity had solved incest avoidance everywhere. Ancient DNA is geographically uneven. Many regions and periods are represented by only a few usable skeletons. Some close kin unions may also go undetected because ancient genomes are incomplete. Still, the broad pattern matters. Even in small ancient communities, reproduction between very close relatives does not appear to have been the normal default across most of this dataset. The genome has preserved the outcome. but it has not preserved the reason. DNA cannot tell us whether two people felt disgust, obeyed a rule, left their birth group, lacked other options, or never considered one another as partners. For that, we have to return from chromosomes to culture. Once humans began turning family relationships into named categories, incest avoidance became far more than a private feeling. A society does not organize itself using percentages of shared DNA. It uses words: mother, brother, cousin, clan member, in-law, outsider. Those words assign responsibilities. They help determine who raises children, who inherits property, who owes food or protection, and who may marry whom. And cultural kinship does not always match biological kinship neatly. A person with little close genetic relationship to you may still belong to your clan and therefore be forbidden as a spouse. An adopted child can be treated completely as a sibling. Meanwhile, some societies permit or even prefer marriages between particular categories of cousins, while forbidding marriage between other cousins who are genetically related by roughly the same degree. From the perspective of genetics alone, that looks inconsistent. From the perspective of social organization, it makes sense. Marriage can connect families, exchange obligations, settle residence patterns, preserve property, or create alliances between groups. A prohibition does not merely say, "Do not reproduce with this person." It also says, "Build your household somewhere else. Connect us to different people." This is where a biological caution becomes a social language. The strongest boundaries usually surround parent, child, and sibling relationships. Beyond that core, cultures draw the lines in remarkably different places. Some rules extend across an entire named lineage. Others distinguish between two kinds of cousin that would look nearly identical on a genetic test. The human family tree had become a traffic map. Some roads closed, some routes encouraged, and every society using different signs. Avoiding close inbreeding may help explain why the map exists. Culture explains why the map became so complicated. But a taboo is not a force field. Humans may possess psychological systems that reduce attraction toward people identified as close family. Societies may surround those relationships with moral rules, shame, and punishment. Neither system guarantees safety. Kin detection depends on clues. If relatives grow up apart, the usual familiarity cues may be missing. If unrelated children grow up together, those same cues may classify them as family. And even when aversion is present, power can override preference. That distinction matters. A voluntary choice between potential partners is not the same problem as coercion inside a dependent relationship. Abuse can involve authority, fear, isolation, economic dependence, or control. Explaining mate preference through evolution does not explain away those forces, and genetic risk is not the central reason coercion is harmful. Cultural rules are also capable of expanding beyond the biological problem that may have helped produce them. A society can prohibit marriage across an entire clan, regulate relationships with people who share no close ancestry, or encourage particular cousin unions because of inheritance, alliance, residence, or political interests. The rule is no longer merely preventing two matching recessive variants from meeting. It is organizing property, loyalty, status, and access to marriage. That organization can protect people. It can also restrict individual choice, preserve unequal power, or apply different standards to different ranks and genders. A boundary presented as ancient and natural may contain layers of historical negotiation underneath it. So, we should not romanticize incest avoidance as a perfect instinct or the incest taboo as a complete social solution. Biology may create caution. Only human institutions decide how that caution is used. So, what is the real answer? Humans probably did not begin avoiding incest on a single day, in one camp, after one unusually awkward family meeting. What we know fairly well is this: reproduction between very close relatives can increase homozygosity and expose harmful recessive variants. Human minds also appear to use childhood cues, especially seeing a mother care for another child and spending years living together to estimate who counts as close kin. And across a large sample of ancient genomes, unions between first cousins or closer relatives were generally uncommon. What we can strongly infer is that natural selection favored several ways of reducing close kin mating before anyone understood heredity. Movement between groups reduced opportunity. Childhood familiarity could reduce attraction. Wider social networks created more possible partners. Culture then named the relationships, drew the boundaries, and attached rules to them. What remains debated is the exact weight of each mechanism. Co-residence matters, but not in every case. Maternal association is powerful, but not universally available. Smell, resemblance, attachment, social pressure, and dispersal may all contribute differently across individuals and societies. And what we cannot know is the first moment an ancestor looked at a close relative and felt that person belonged permanently in the category of family rather than mate. So, humans did not simply decide to avoid incest. The genetic cost created pressure. Development supplied imperfect clues. Culture turned those clues into rules. No single layer tells the whole story. Now, return to that imaginary dating app. It does not need to compare surnames, inspect family records, or request a saliva sample before every swipe. Long before adulthood, your mind has already spent years sorting people into categories. Who shared your home? Who received care from the same adults? Who was present so early and so often that imagining them as anything other than family feels wrong? The system is useful precisely because it works before conscious explanation. But it is not a perfect detector. It can mistake familiarity for genetic relatedness, miss biological relatives raised elsewhere, and be reinforced or overridden by culture and power. That is why there was probably no first incest taboo in the simple sense. There was no single inventor, and no moment when humanity discovered recessive genes around a fire. There were inherited costs, movements between groups, childhood cues, expanding social networks, and rules that accumulated over generations. Today, we can map genomes and calculate degrees of relatedness. Our ancestors could not. They had something faster, rougher, and much older. The brain was already keeping notes on who shared the food, who shared the caregivers, and who had always belonged beside the family fire. It was never reading your DNA. It was reading your childhood.